Hello, I'm Professor Margarethe Wiersema, visiting the Copenhagen Business School from the University of California, Irvine. And I'm here today to interview Louise about a recent paper published in Organization Science with her co-author Michelle Rogan from INSEAD on the subject of a network perspective on individual level ambidexterity in organizations. So Louisa, tell me, what does it mean to be ambidextrous?
To be ambidextrous means that you can use both your left and your right hand at the same time. And in organizational terms, it means that you can actually juggle the trade-off between exploration and exploitation. Where exploration is the pursuit of new business, new knowledge, new ideas, and exploitation is the pursuit of the existing knowledge, existing business, or implementation, as we often see in organizations. Now, just as it's rare to see individuals who are ambidextrous or can use both the left and the right hand equally well, it's difficult for organizations to balance this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. Now, why is it difficult? Well, first of all, it's difficult because exploration means the pursuit of something that's new, risky, and sometimes the payoff is actually quite far off in time. In addition, exploration and exploitation often requires different resources, different skills, and so on. And that means that there's a tendency in most organizations to pursue exploration for a period of time, but then there's often a tendency towards exploitation. And therefore we see that it's hard, that organizations struggle with this balance between exploration and exploitation in organizations. So how do we solve that problem? The way that organizations usually solve it is to first pursue exploration, then exploitation, or alternatively to separate exploration and exploitation activities into different departments, for example an R&D department and then a sales department for implementation. And that means this problem usually is solved at the organizational level and therefore also has been studied at the organizational level. We, on the other hand, study it at the individual level because we know that organizations consist of managers, individual managers who set priorities in organizations and therefore also, of course, determine how resources are allocated and how we prioritize between exploration and exploitation.
So your study is one of the first then to really try to understand the notion of ambidexterity at the individual rather than the organizational level. So you did a really good job of explaining what it means from an organizational level, and I can understand at the organization that you'd have different units in the organization. Some of them may be oriented towards exploitation, and some of them might be oriented towards exploration. But how does an individual manager, how do you go about assessing their ability to be ambidextrous?
Right. So there are a few studies who've looked at ambidexterity, from the individual level perspective, but mostly they've been thinking about managers as solving this problem at the cognitive level, or they pursue exploration first and exploitation. Now my co-author and I conceptualize this differently. We think about it as managers being able to balance this trade-off between exploration and exploitation by utilizing their network of contacts. Now, if you think about it, we all have these network of contacts of, for example, colleagues inside the organization that we have relationships with, and we might have relationships externally too with customers or investors and other stakeholders, the managerial community. And these contacts we can draw on for these different activities of exploration and exploitation. And so we think about managers as being ambidextrous by activating different parts of their contact network.
Oh. So an interesting linkage between your social network and then your actual behavior in the firm. So how, tell me a little bit about how you went about studying, how did you identify the sample or the company that you decided to focus on in terms of understanding this relationship between managers' networks and their ability to be ambidextrous?
We looked at a large professional services firm, a management consulting firm, and at the time of the study when we looked at this firm, it was a firm employing more than 55,000 professionals and operating in more than 100 countries. And what we did was we went and spoke to some of the managers at this firm. In fact, we interviewed 32 senior managers in Western Europe. And they talked to us about this challenge between balancing exploration and exploitation. and how they might manage that challenge. And we found that really interesting. So to study this more systematically, we went back and we conducted a network survey where you ask individual managers about the relationships that they have both inside the firm and outside the firm, and how they might utilize those network of contacts. And then we linked that to their ambidextrous behavior.
And so what did you find from examining this in this professional firm?
Well, as we talked about earlier, this idea comes from network theory, that the way your network looks will actually determine behaviors in organizations. It will also determine the resources you have access to, for example, the diversity of information or the resources that you're able to mobilize. So we did this, first we separated between the internal contact network, as I spoke about previously, and then the contacts that these managers have outside the firm. And then we focused on three main characteristics of their contact network. First, we looked at the density of the network, which basically has to do with the interconnectedness of the people around you. So if you know a number of people, or if you have a number of contacts in your LinkedIn network, if they all know each other, we would talk about a high density network. Whereas if you have a network where not many people know each other, then we'd say that would be a low density network. The second characteristic that we looked at was the heterogeneity or the diversity of the contacts. And we thought about that in terms of how they belong to different types of units in the firm. And then finally, we looked at the informality of the network. Most or many firms will encourage that you develop your contact network as a part of the formal role that you play in the firm. But of course, we know that people also develop contacts that are independent of the formal role that we play. So in your professional network, you might be associated with other people in the managerial community, for example, or have other industry contacts, which not necessarily are directly associated with your formal role. So we also looked at the informality of the contact network.
Mm-hmm. So you examine all these attributes, and what were some of the key findings that you discovered?
So the most interesting thing was that we were actually able to say that ambidextrous managers have networks that look different from those managers who have a tendency towards either purely exploration or exploitation activities. And in our sample, it turned out that as many as 43% of the senior managers that we looked at actually tended to be ambidextrous. Now, this is in line with this idea that research has shown that there is an association between formal decision-making authority and ambidexterity, obviously because there's this, you make the priorities in terms of thinking about the allocation of resources and so on. But still we had variation across these exploration, exploitation and ambidextrous managers.
So 43%, that's quite high. I would not have guessed that there's that many managers that can manage both sides of how to behave, or the kind of nature of their decision-making in an organization. And other key insights?
Well, what we found was that in the internal network of colleagues, those senior managers that had open or low density networks were more likely to be ambidextrous. And we argue that this is because that would allow them access to more diversity of information. Because when you have an open network, there's less likely to be redundancy in the kind of things that you know. And so that's associated with being able to explore for new business. In addition, we found that high informality was important in the external network. And we make an argument that this is because it allows you for the autonomy needed to pursue the risky exploration activities.
So that's very interesting. And overall, so what are the implications for organizations and the nature of managers, and the perspective on networks as an attribute that an individual has that obviously has significant organizational implications?
Well, we think it has two main important implications. The first is that this idea that network characteristics at the individual level can affect firm outcomes, including firm performance and firm survival. In fact, if you think about this idea of the informality of the network, where in most firms there is a tendency towards utilizing the formal network of contacts, And that we find leads to a tendency towards exploitation. And in fact, some of the managers we spoke to in the firm mentioned that if no one was to pursue new business for as little as 6 months, the firm would not be able to survive. So this idea that you pursue the informality will help you with ambidexterity. And we think the second main implication is this idea that you can actually manage the network in terms of helping you overcome this tendency towards exploitation, but actually managing this trade-off between exploration and exploitation. Now, of course, we don't argue that all managers should be or can even be ambidextrous, but it's certainly helpful if there are some managers who are able to balance this trade-off, and as we then suggest, they're able to do that through the network.
Well, great. Tremendous insights, and I think they have applicability across a lot of firms that rely on human capital as their major source of advantage in the marketplace. And I very much look forward to reading your article in more depth, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Margarethe.